Most men believe they lose a woman because they did something wrong. They replay conversations. They analyze messages. They search for the exact moment things changed. But the truth is usually quieter and more uncomfortable. Women don't slowly pull away because a man failed. They pull away because the man became emotionally predictable in a way that felt permanent. I saw this clearly through the experience of Ryan, a 29-year-old project coordinator living in a fast-paced coastal city. Ryan wasn't flashy. He didn't rely on charm or pressure. What he offered instead was steadiness, something many people claim they want until they have it. He met Clara during a transitional period in her life. She was 27, recently settled into a new career, and adjusting to independence. At first, Ryan felt like stability.
He checked in.
He listened. He remembered details. He made her feel emotionally safe without demanding anything in return. And that was the beginning of the shift. Attraction often grows fastest when there is uncertainty, when effort feels optional, not guaranteed. But over time, Clara stopped seeing Ryan's presence as something earned. It became something assumed. Not consciously, not maliciously, but gradually. Ryan noticed small changes before Clara ever did. Replies took longer. Plans became less certain. Warmth softened into familiarity. When he asked if everything was okay, she said yes, and meant it, because she hadn't yet questioned her own emotional drift. This is the stage most men misunderstand. When a woman starts taking a man for granted, she's not deciding to leave. She's deciding not to invest as much. And that distinction matters. Clara still liked Ryan. She still enjoyed his company. She still felt comfortable around him. But comfort, when left unexamined, can quietly replace appreciation. Ryan continued showing up the same way he always had. Same patience. Same availability. Same emotional openness. He believed consistency would reinforce connection. Instead, it removed contrast. What once felt supportive now felt expected. What once felt intentional now felt automatic. And because Ryan never withdrew his energy, Clara never had to reflect on its value. Psychologically, this is where imbalance begins. When one person gives freely without requiring reciprocity, the other unconsciously adjusts their effort downward, not because they don't care, but because the cost feels low. Clara didn't wake up thinking, I don't value him. She woke up thinking, he'll understand. And that belief is dangerous. Because understanding without boundaries slowly erodes attraction. Ryan sensed something was off but couldn't name it. He didn't want to pressure her. He didn't want to seem insecure. So he leaned further into being supportive, hoping reassurance would stabilize the connection. But reassurance without standards doesn't create closeness. It creates emotional dependency on one side only. Clara, meanwhile, began experiencing something subtle but powerful, emotional complacency. She knew Ryan would be there. She knew he would respond. She knew he wouldn't walk away over distance or ambiguity. That knowledge reduced urgency. And urgency is the engine of desire. This is the uncomfortable truth many men avoid. Being dependable is attractive, but being endlessly available is not. Ryan never withdrew. Never recalibrated. Never challenged the imbalance. So Clara's emotional investment quietly declined, not into disinterest, but into assumption. She assumed he'd wait. She assumed he'd adapt. She assumed the dynamic was fixed. And fixed dynamics rarely inspire growth. Eventually, Ryan noticed he was the only one initiating deeper conversations. The only one suggesting future plans. The only one adjusting his schedule. He wasn't unhappy, but he was uneasy. And unease is the body's early warning system. When he finally expressed how he felt, not with accusation but honesty, Clara was surprised. Not defensive. Just unaware. She hadn't realized how much he had been carrying alone. That's when something clicked for Ryan. He realized he had made himself emotionally indispensable, but not emotionally valued. There's a difference. Being valued means your presence is chosen. Being indispensable means your presence is assumed. And assumption kills polarity. Ryan didn't leave immediately, but something shifted inside him. He stopped over-explaining. He stopped filling silence. He stopped proving his worth through patience alone. Not to punish Clara, but to protect himself. And that was the first time Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Uncertainty. Not fear. Not loss. But awareness. For the first time, Ryan's energy wasn't guaranteed. This is the first psychological stage when a woman begins taking a man for granted, long before she misses him. It happens when consistency is mistaken for permanence, when patience is mistaken for weakness, when emotional generosity is mistaken for obligation. Clara didn't lose interest in Ryan. She lost sensitivity to his value. And that loss didn't feel dramatic. It felt normal. Until it wasn't. Most men believe that if a woman begins pulling away, the solution is to lean in harder. More reassurance. More availability. More explanation. That instinct feels logical, but it often does the opposite of what's intended. I saw this play out with Daniel, a 34-year-old logistics manager living in a busy inland city. Daniel was thoughtful, measured, and deeply reliable. He had spent most of his adult life believing that emotional consistency was the foundation of strong relationships. And for a long time it was. He met Sophia at a professional networking event. She was 31, ambitious, articulate, and navigating a period of personal growth. At first, their connection felt balanced. Conversation flowed naturally. Effort was mutual. Curiosity was alive. But over time, the balance shifted. Not because Sophia lost interest, but because Daniel never stopped compensating. Whenever plans became uncertain, Daniel adjusted. Whenever communication slowed, he filled the gap. Whenever emotional distance appeared, he smoothed it over. His intentions were sincere. He wanted stability. He believed patience would restore momentum. Instead, patience became permission. Sophia never asked Daniel to carry more emotional weight, but she grew accustomed to him doing it anyway. She assumed he'd handle the uncertainty, that he'd absorb the pauses, that he'd stay grounded no matter how uneven the exchange became. And because Daniel never withdrew, Sophia never had to step forward. This is where absence begins to matter, not physically, but energetically. Daniel eventually noticed that he was initiating nearly everything. Not out of anxiety, but out of habit. Habit can be just as damaging as insecurity. When he paused to observe the dynamic, he saw something clearly. Sophia wasn't investing less because she didn't care. She was investing less because she didn't need to. So Daniel did something unfamiliar. He stopped chasing clarity. He didn't announce a shift. He didn't create drama. He simply matched her level of engagement. Messages became less frequent, but still warm. Invitations became fewer, but still genuine. He didn't disappear. He recalibrated. And this is where psychology takes over. At first, Sophia barely noticed. When someone has been consistently available, their reduced presence doesn't register immediately. The mind assumes it's temporary. He's probably busy. He'll reach out later. But as days passed, something subtle changed. The emotional cushion Daniel once provided was gone. There was no hostility.
No tensión.
Just space. And space invites reflection. Sophia began noticing moments where she expected Daniel to show up, and he didn't. Not out of spite. Simply because he was no longer filling gaps that weren't being met halfway. This is the stage where many women misinterpret what they're feeling. It's not longing yet. It's not regret. It's disruption. When a man stops compensating, the emotional structure shifts. And the person who benefited from that structure suddenly feels the weight of their own passivity. Sophia found herself checking her phone more often, rereading conversations,
Wondering if she had missed something.
not because Daniel had changed drastically, but because he no longer oriented his behavior around her emotional comfort. This is where absence becomes loud. Not through silence, but through the removal of predictability. Daniel didn't disappear. He stayed calm, focused, polite. But he stopped chasing engagement that wasn't being returned. And for the first time, Sophia had to decide whether to step forward or let distance grow. This is a critical psychological moment. When a woman realizes a man is no longer waiting in emotional standby mode, her perception of his value shifts. Not because he's rare, but because access to him is no longer guaranteed. Sophia tried subtle re-engagement. A casual message. A light question.
A familiar tone.
Daniel responded, but without overinvestment. He didn't punish her. He didn't reward the bare minimum either. And that balance unsettled her, because it removed leverage. She couldn't assume he was emotionally anchored to her response, or lack of one. What many men fail to understand is this. Attraction doesn't grow when you give more. It grows when effort is met with equal presence. Daniel wasn't playing a game. He was honoring reciprocity. And that forced Sophia into awareness. She started reflecting, not on what Daniel was doing, but on what she wasn't. On how comfortable she had become receiving without contributing. On how little urgency she felt because she believed he'd remain regardless. Now that belief was gone. Distance doesn't hurt when it's expected. It hurts when it's earned. Sophia didn't suddenly miss Daniel. She noticed his absence. And noticing comes before missing. That awareness lingered. Not painfully, but persistently. It followed her into quiet moments. It surfaced when interactions with others felt shallower by comparison. Because Daniel had offered something stable, and now that stability had stepped back. Not withdrawn. Not withheld. Just repositioned. This is the second stage when a woman begins reconsidering a man she once took for granted. Not when he pleads. Not when he explains. But when he stops doing the emotional work alone. Distance, when calm and intentional, doesn't push people away. It reveals imbalance. And imbalance, once seen, cannot be unseen. When a woman begins to sense that a man is no longer emotionally anchored to her, something unexpected happens inside her. There is no immediate panic.
No dramatic realization.
No sudden confession of feelings. Instead, a quiet internal tension begins to form. This tension isn't about losing him yet. It's about losing certainty. I watched this unfold with Sophia over the weeks that followed Daniel's shift. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. She was still social, still focused on her career, still surrounded by options. But internally, her emotional landscape had changed. She was no longer fully relaxed. Before, Daniel's presence had been predictable. Not boring, stable. She knew where he stood. She knew he'd respond. She knew he'd adjust. That certainty created comfort, but it also created complacency.
Now that safety net was gone.
And the human mind reacts strongly when predictability disappears. Sophia began replaying moments she hadn't questioned before. Conversations she'd taken lightly. Delays she assumed wouldn't matter. Effort she postponed because she believed time was abundant. It wasn't regret yet. It was curiosity mixed with unease. Why hadn't he followed up? Why wasn't he asking for reassurance? Why did he seem unaffected? This is the phase many men never see because it happens entirely in silence. Women rarely verbalize this stage. Not because they're hiding something, but because they're processing it internally. Sophia didn't feel rejected. She felt unsettled. And unsettled emotions demand resolution. She began comparing Daniel to others more consciously. Conversations that once felt exciting now felt surface level. Attention from others felt loud instead of grounding. The contrast was subtle, but it mattered. Daniel hadn't been intense. He'd been steady. And now that steadiness was no longer automatically available. What's important to understand here is this. When a man removes emotional overavailability without resentment, he doesn't create fear. He creates reflection. Sophia started asking herself questions she hadn't needed to before. Was she actually investing or just receiving? Did she value Daniel, or just the way he made things easier? Had she assumed his patience meant permanence? These questions are uncomfortable because they point inward. And most people avoid inward discomfort unless something forces it. Distance does that. But not all distance works this way. If Daniel had vanished abruptly, it would have triggered defensiveness. If he had acted cold or resentful, it would have closed the emotional door. Instead, he stayed composed. When they spoke, he was present but not chasing. Interested, but not seeking reassurance. Engaged, but not orbiting. This behavior disrupted Sophia's emotional narrative. She couldn't label him as needy anymore. She couldn't label him as distant either. That ambiguity created tension. And tension creates attention. She found herself wondering what he was focused on. What occupied his time. Whether someone else now received the steadiness she once assumed was reserved for her. That's when the internal conflict deepened. Because now, the possibility of loss entered the picture, not dramatically, but realistically. And loss only becomes real when someone realizes they didn't secure what they assumed was guaranteed. Sophia didn't suddenly feel a surge of desire. She felt awareness. Awareness that Daniel wasn't positioning himself around her emotional gravity anymore. Awareness that she might need to step forward, or step away consciously. This is the moment where emotional tests often intensify. She asked questions that seemed casual but carried weight. She hinted at shared experiences. She subtly probed for reassurance without directly asking. Daniel didn't resist these moments, but he didn't collapse into them either. He responded honestly,
Calmly.
without urgency. And that calm response told her something important. He wasn't afraid of her decisions. This realization is powerful. Because fearlessness isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply doesn't chase certainty. Sophia felt something unfamiliar, a sense that Daniel was no longer waiting for her to decide his emotional future. That's when attraction starts to change shape. Not spike. Not explode. But solidify. Attraction rooted in security feels exciting. Attraction rooted in respect feels grounding. And grounding attraction lasts longer. Sophia didn't talk about this with friends. She didn't post about it. She didn't dramatize it. She carried it quietly. And that quiet internal conflict grew stronger each time Daniel remained consistent, without overreaching. She realized something unsettling but honest. Daniel wasn't withdrawing to manipulate her. He was simply no longer compensating for imbalance. And that realization shifted responsibility back to her. This is where many women decide one of two paths. They either step into greater emotional presence, or they drift away entirely. What matters is this. Both outcomes require the man to stay grounded. Daniel didn't attempt to control the outcome. He accepted uncertainty. And in doing so, he reclaimed his emotional center. That alone changed everything. Every connection eventually reaches a quiet crossroads. Not a dramatic breakup. Not a clear confession. But a moment where distance has revealed the truth of investment. For Sophia, that moment didn't arrive with conflict. It arrived with clarity. Weeks had passed since Daniel stopped filling emotional gaps that weren't being met halfway. He hadn't withdrawn affection. He hadn't punished her with silence. He had simply continued living his life without placing her at its emotional center. And now, the responsibility to move things forward no longer rested on him. This is where many women feel exposed, not judged, but seen. Because when a man stops chasing and remains emotionally steady, a woman is forced to confront her own level of commitment. Sophia began noticing something important. Daniel was no longer available on demand. When she suggested plans last minute, he sometimes declined, not coldly but honestly. When conversations drifted, he didn't pull them back with effort. When she delayed responses, he didn't mirror anxiety. And instead of feeling rejected, she felt challenged. Not by words, but by consistency. This stage creates emotional pressure. Not the kind that suffocates. The kind that clarifies. Sophia realized she had two options. She could step forward, bringing intention, consistency, and presence. Or she could step away, accepting that Daniel wasn't going to remain emotionally available without reciprocity. What made the decision difficult wasn't fear of losing him. It was realizing that if she stepped forward, she would have to show up differently. No more assumed access. No more half investment. No more emotional convenience. And that kind of honesty requires courage. Daniel didn't ask her to decide. That's what made the choice real. One evening, After a calm conversation that lacked intensity but carried weight, Sophia felt it clearly. This connection would only continue if she invested. So she did something simple but revealing. She initiated a conversation with purpose. Not to test. Not to flirt. Not to probe. To contribute. She expressed interest in shared direction. She asked questions about Daniel's goals, not casually but attentively. She followed through on plans without hesitation. She showed presence without performing. And Daniel noticed. But he didn't overreact. He received the effort calmly, appreciatively, without validation hunger. This response told Sophia something powerful. She wasn't rescuing the connection. She was joining it. This distinction matters more than most people realize. When a woman feels she is saving a connection, resentment grows. When she feels she is choosing into a connection, respect grows. Daniel had created that space by not forcing resolution. Not all stories end this way. Sometimes, the woman doesn't step forward. Sometimes, she chooses familiarity elsewhere, or distraction, or emotional comfort without depth. And that outcome isn't failure. It's filtration. Because a man who holds his emotional frame without resentment doesn't lose. He either gains alignment or gains clarity. Daniel understood this. He knew that chasing presence creates compliance, not connection. That availability without boundaries creates dependency, not desire. That leadership begins with self-direction. So whether Sophia stepped forward or walked away, he remained steady. And that steadiness was the foundation. This is the final stage many men misunderstand. They think power in relationships comes from control. It doesn't. It comes from emotional self-possession. From being willing to lose what doesn't align rather than shrinking to keep it. From knowing that connection should add to life, not become its axis. Sophia didn't feel pressured. She felt invited. And that invitation carried weight because it wasn't desperate. This is why calm confidence outlasts intensity. This is why presence matters more than pursuit. This is why the man who stops chasing doesn't lose attraction. He reveals whether it ever existed. If there's one truth to take from this entire story, it's this. People don't value what never requires effort. They value what requires intention. When you stop overgiving, you don't become cold. You become clear. And clarity is magnetic.